Ahoy! Yesterday I talked about things that I really enjoy about the New World expansion. But I already told you, I like to have a nuanced view on things and talk about all of the aspects, and there are also plenty of aspects that I don't enjoy. So today I'll discuss things that I believe the expansion simply got wrong. In the next days we'll also be talking about things that I think the expansion got partially right, but that also need improvements. We're going to start with a few medium level issues because I have one that is very important to me at the end that I want to go into more detail about. So the first thing that I think is just not really well done is the trade skill rework. I said yesterday I really like the new crafting systems and upgrading systems, those are great, but beyond that, there's just a lot of stuff that just feels left behind, neglected, and basically is just not existent in the expansion. I'm not talking about bags and tools here because I think those were actually just bugged on PTR, but trade skills like furnishing and fishing. You get a handful of new recipes in furnishing, which as far as I can tell you can get just from leveling up the skill. And in fishing there doesn't seem to be a single hotspot that is above 200 so far. This may have been PTR issues, maybe they've had some last minute additions to this and maybe I'm wrong here, but so far it just looks like an afterthought. For many of the more niche trade skills, I think the main reason to upgrade them will be aptitude caches. That is not exactly engaging new content. And as much as I dislike how they did it with the asset chest, even Brimstone Sands had a full new furniture set. What I find a completely unnecessary new addition are the Heartrune upgrades. The Heartrunes can be upgraded to 700 gear score. I don't know how much that actually does for scaling. I'm sure it will affect damage scaling on at least some of them, but you can't see that on your database because it doesn't scale with the gear score. And you can see the upgrade recipe here, it's the same for all of them. It's 50 gypsum orbs, I guess this is meant to be a gypsum orb sink, which in itself is understandable, but then it's also runic voidstone and mithril ingots, which you will need for plenty of other things in the beginning, and a ton of vials of suspended Azoth. Now, I don't mind at all that they're creating gypsum orb sinks, that's completely fine with me, but I don't think it should be on Heartrunes, because Heartrunes are already incredibly expensive to upgrade to tier 3 in the first place. And I think Heartrunes are a really cool addition to the game, and people should be able to experiment with them and adjust according to different things they want to try out. But at the moment, even the upgrade cost to just upgrade a Heartrune to tier 3 to 625 gear score is so prohibitive that most people have maybe 2 or 3 upgraded Heartrunes at best. They have Stoneform, Detonate, and then maybe one utility Heartrune, and that's already a high bar. Quite a few people probably just have Stoneform or Detonate. And now you have to upgrade those same Heartrunes again, and even more so than before make the decision, am I going to invest this much for the upgrade if there's something that I want, that I will like long term? So it just doesn't feel worth upgrading different Heartrunes, it feels like you're getting punished for doing so. Elite chest runs are, in my opinion, not good content. And one of the content aspects that they named for the expansion are 2 new elite chest runs, like that's some major big deal. And I'd like to show you a poll that I posted today where I asked about exactly this, if people like elite chest runs and faction missions, we'll get to that a little bit later. Even if we count out the people that voted neutral, you would still end up with less than half of the community actually liking elite chest runs. And looking at the replies, a lot were saying they like elite chest runs for the rewards. I highly doubt people would be doing elite chest runs if it wasn't for the loot. I don't think they would enjoy running around looting chests if there wasn't something good in there. Before you say everyone does everything for loot, look at what both speedrunners and war players are doing. None of them are doing that for the loot. My concern is the same that I have with world events. My feeling is that the devs look at these stats and say, oh look, people are doing this, they're spending time on this, so they must be enjoying this. But that's not necessarily true. They might just be doing it as a chore that they need to get done in order to get the rewards necessary, or because of fear of missing out or something like that. So really, I think elite chest runs are not a big part of the content and they shouldn't be looked as such, and they shouldn't be a focus of what the devs are making. Now, I will say that I have heard the new chest runs add some mechanics that make them a little bit more interesting, so that's maybe a step in the right direction, but really if they want to make this content piece that is elite chest runs, then make it in a way where zerging it is not rewarded and the mobs actually scale up when there are more people there, so you actually actively need to fight the mobs, you actually have some challenge while on a chest run, that there's at least something at stake there that makes it at least a little more interesting. And I know that currently you can solo run the chest runs, but that doesn't really make sense if you're doing it for the rewards and you get the same amount of rewards in a Zerg much easier. The expansion comes with various weapon changes, some that I have some mixed feelings on, and I will discuss that in a separate video, so if you're interested in that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. But one weapon in particular that stands out to me as a just purely negative change is the Rapier change. There's a weekend addition to Keen Tondo, which I'm completely fine with, but there's a change to Leeching Flurry. Increase the gear score bonus while on a weapon and added 1 second of invulnerability when activating Flurry. I'm sorry, why? Flurry got a ton of buffs just recently. It got grit, it got improved tracking, it got consistent damage across all hits, and it got the addition of a bleed on the last hit as well. Flurry is a very strong Rapier ability. It is so good that it's now outclassing all other Rapier abilities in PvE. Bleed Rapiers mostly stop running Tondo because you can get the keen Tondo effect from leeching Flurry, so you don't actually need to run the skill at all, just to do more damage with Flurry over and over and get additional damage on Flurry from evade. So why is this getting more buffs? Invulnerability allows you to avoid a variety of boss mechanics in PvE and just generally be extremely safe while you're healing yourself and while you have grit, so no risk to you at all. And in PvP it's even worse. We're at a point where now musket players and bow players are considering running Rapier offhand with leeching Flurry as a defensive tool, kinda like Riposte, because you have damage immunity and you heal back for a ton if you get jumped on. That's exactly the opposite direction of where they wanted to take the Rapier. When they initially started making changes to it, they wanted to make the bleed tree more viable. They didn't want the weapon to just be this super defensive runaway weapon in PvP, and now they're pushing it exactly further in that direction. The problem with Flurry in PvP remains the relatively weak tracking even after the buffs, meaning it's relatively easy to avoid the hits, and since the weapon is a split scaling with int, it doesn't scale well with most other melee weapons, so that's why it's not that good. That's things you can adjust. Adding an invulnerability solves none of that, but creates a whole lot of balance issues. And speaking of balance issues, why is stamina recovery still in the game? And assuming the New World database numbers are correct, this is actually even better than before. You just get full stamina back now with this. So yeah, that just makes no sense. This perk is way too strong, it's way too broken, it's been broken since release. Why? Why is the cooldown so short? Why do we have to have this in the first place? I have no words. And then there is Refreshing Recovery, which I thought was meant to replace it or like compete with it because this resets all of your cooldowns. But it actually doesn't because it's a separate label, so you can actually have both at the same time. At this point, it almost feels like amulets are balanced by a completely different person from who's designing the rest of the balance for New World. I have no other explanation for this. It's so strange. It's so completely out of place with how good many other balance changes have been. A big complaint of mine are the rewards that you seem to get from PvP so far. There are almost no good PvP rewards compared to the amount of good PvE rewards when it comes to especially named upgradable gear. There are many sets that aren't even continued, like for example there is no new version of Helm of the Bear, whereas there's new versions of all the armor sets from Expeditions. New Russia gear doesn't seem to have the new perks on it either, from Outpost Rush caches, and the Russia patterns are maybe just discontinued entirely. It's just very unclear what's going on there. It just feels like somebody didn't finish that in time maybe. So I can only hope here that this is just a PTR thing and they were just working on all of the PvP rewards still, so that we'll see a lot more of that by the time the expansion comes around. Dark Matter also seems harder to get with PvP, even though there may be some bugs. Like, I think you are supposed to get some at the end of OPR if you reach a certain score, but it only happens very rarely and usually not near first game. So I have no clue what's going on there, but again, this just seems very unfinished, unpolished. There should be better rewards, and this is especially true for the new event as well, for the new races, territory races, because you are not getting many good rewards from that at the moment at all, even though according to the devs it's meant to be a great place for rewards. And that brings us to the one that is very personal to me, which are the influence races, the open world PvP changes. As you may know, I absolutely love open world PvP. It's the first thing I did when I started playing New World, it's the first thing I did when Fresh Start came out. It's one of the main things I enjoy when well done. As such, I was very excited for the influence race changes that they announced because it sounded very promising. We would get these towers, we would fight over these towers, and there would be more PvP in those zones. Then I went on PTR, and towers is first of all a bit of an overstatement. I would call them pieces of rubble, maybe. So yeah, that's a weird word to choose for that. And then also, what? I don't know how to put this any better. The whole thing, the whole problem that a lot of people had with influence pushers was that it was simply one of the worst parts of the game. You run back and forth doing these PvE missions over and over. Maybe some PvP will happen, but usually it's more annoying if anything. It's just some range players that try to kite people away and try to snipe someone, and not really any active good PvP fighting over a spot or something. And along with that you have the fort, where you have to sit around for ages to capture the fort. And now you have 3 extra points that you can sit around in and capture. Now, these points are quicker to capture and you get some rewards for doing so. Weirdly enough, you once again don't get any rewards for holding them, so you're actually encouraged to just run between all 3 points all the time to get as many rewards as possible, I guess, which is Again, very, very weird. But also, that's it, pretty much. There are no deeper mechanics at play here that I could see that would make it any more interesting in any way. So I'm really not sure if this will be enough to revive open world. It might if the rewards are so good and actually fixed after PTR that people just want to show up purely for the rewards all the time. But for that to happen, I didn't even need to do the tower system. You could have just given the better rewards and people would have done the same thing. Holding the towers gets 1% influence per minute and a little bit more if you hold multiple at once, a little bit of a bonus there. But overall, this is not the fastest way to get influence. Faction missions will still be faster, at least they were on PTR, according to what other people said, especially if you have more than just a handful of people. And I know there used to be someone on the dev team, I don't know if that person is still there, who was generally saying that faction missions are good enough content. I want to show you, once again, the poll that I made here. Look at what small portion of the player base actually likes faction missions. And I was hoping that we'd get a massive overhaul to those and what you can do in those faction missions, but it's the same stuff with slightly different locations closer to these points. That's it. That's not an overhaul, that's just shuffling things around a little bit. At the same time, the expansion ties a lot of rewards to faction tokens. For example, you get the new craft materials through faction tokens for your cooldown crafts, for example. And you also have various faction missions that you need to do for the season pass. Yet unless you win the influence race, you don't get any tokens at all. And I think if you win, you get 30,000, I've been told. So the maximum here isn't even particularly high when you consider you could probably just do some faction missions for the same thing and not have to run nearly as long. So yeah, I could rant on and on and on about this, but really it's not much to say other than it just doesn't seem like very much in terms of changes and not something that they should have hyped up half a year ago saying, yeah, this is something we're really working on, we're trying to get this right, when it was just this. I would have much rather seen them copy assets that they had already in place. Like, for example, take the fort that they have in Monarch's Bluff for the new questline, put that somewhere else and make that one of the towers that you need to contest. Even if it's copied, I don't care. At least that's a more complex area for PvP that makes things a lot more interesting instead of these places of rubble that don't really matter much at all. Look, maybe I'm wrong here. The timed windows still mean that at least the PvP is somewhat concentrated, so if there are enough open world players interested in it, then maybe it'll work out. But at the end of the day, to me, this is just outpost rush in the open world. You have 3 points that you need to capture, or 4 in this case, whatever, and then you have to run missions that are effectively PvE missions and not actually PvP. Much like in OPR, you have your PvE stuff on the side that you can use to amplify the bases. It's very, very similar, and conceptually there could be so much more. You could, for example, make specific hot zones. You could say, okay, for this time frame, this one of the towers gives you double points. That could immediately push people towards that point and consider, okay, do we fight over this point or we do hold the other two? You know, just go crazy with it. Have flags that you can bring between the points for extra score. So much that could be done that's more than just, yeah, here's some rubble. And last but not least, I like that the timed windows will give us a better idea of when PvP is happening where, but it also seems like, based on what the devs have said so far, that this will likely lead to companies having a much easier time holding the whole map if they're dominating. Overall, for being the biggest PvP feature of the expansion, this feels very underwhelming to me. I'm happy to be proven wrong here though. If this works out, I'm more than happy. So now I have talked about what I dislike, and if you haven't seen my video about what I like, I will link that here so you can check it out. But I will also talk about things that I think were at least okay, but need some improvements, or are maybe towards the bad side, but not bad enough to mention them here basically. So anything that's more of a middle ground. That will be happening in the next days, so if you're interested in that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. If you'd like to support me further and get early trading and farming tips for the expansion, you can do so on Patreon. Thanks to my patrons who already do exactly that. Thanks for watching. Sloth out.